Thank you very much, and it's my great pleasure to open a discussion this morning, which will last until 11:30. I have to replace to Monica and apologize for that, but I'm going to do my best to fit in her shoes. So I'm actually vice chairman of the EU-ASE, working for Schneider Electric. And we have the great pleasure to organize this workshop with DENEFF, a German partner. So today is going to be about carbon pricing and buildings, a super important topic. And you just see Christian Noll from DENEFF. So again, very glad to organize a meeting with DENEFF. And Christian will say a final words at the end of our meeting. But it's a super important meeting. It's a super important discussion. We have the Fit for 55 package coming up in a couple of days. So this discussion is super timely, and we are very happy to have three distinguished speakers that will enlighten our conversation, our understanding of the situation, and take example and experience from Germany, which has been a first mover on applying carbon pricing for building. So our four speakers with Christian will be first pleasure to welcome Hans Bergman, who is the head of unit for DGCLIMA, in charge of policy development and auctioning for ETS. Hans has been starting to work for the Commission since 2007, already around the issue of ETS. And before he joined the Commission, he used to work for the Swedish Ministry for Environment. So very happy to have you with us today, Hans, and you will kick off the discussion. Then we have Sibylle Braungardt, senior researcher for Öko-Institut. Dr. Sibylle Braungardt has been working for the Öko-Institut since 2017. And she's an expert in energy efficiency and renewable energy in the heating sector. And she has been writing extensively on the issue of energy policy and energy transition, also at the University College of Freiburg. So welcome, Sibylle. Last but not least, very happy as well to have Louise Sunderland. She's advisor and policy analyst at RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project. Louise has been working on energy efficiency for more than 10 years. She graduated from the Imperial College of London, and she has been working quite a lot on the issue, and especially the issue of carbon pricing. Last but not least, Christian Noll, as I say, managing director of DENEFF, a very keen partner for the event and a partner in Germany. We are working a lot with DENEFF, as you know. All right, so the webinar today, first we are going to have the presentation from the three speakers I just presented. Then we'll have a Q&A with you, so please write your question on the Q&A section of the platform so that I could ask question after the initial presentation. This webinar is recorded and everything will be available, including the slides after the event. All right, so thank you very much again to join. Now we'll turn Hans, maybe Hans Bergman, if you could put on your camera, would be very nice. And actually all the speakers could do it as well, maybe a bit more interactive.
Do so.
All right, thank you very much. Okay. All right, so welcome again, welcome everyone. So I'm going to start with you, Hans, because again, we are trying to understand what's going on in Germany and the lessons, but in the context of the Future EU initiative on ETS, we understand that it's quite likely that the Commission is going to present something on buildings within ETS, within or in parallel to the ETS system. So could you tell us your view and the measures that, from your point of view, we need to unfold the potential of the sector in terms of carbon pricing? So, Hans.
Thank you for inviting me. important energy saving, etc. It's as you know, in the EU, perhaps briefly now, we have this system where emissions are divided in two parts. Around half covered by the EU ETS as big emitters, and there's basically a EU-wide system. Well, there is an EU-wide system with carbon pricing, and then on the industry and power sector, and there are other emissions coming from, for example, buildings, heating, and the road transport is covered by member states, and each member states have separate targets, and aim is that they could together reach the EU target. So now, as you know, we have a 40% target for 2030, and it was decided that we should go to 55%, and therefore we have to upgrade our legislation in all aspects. So yeah, what is perhaps not an issue here, but okay, but this ETS that we have for power and industry, we have to sort of reduce to come to the market. Now, for the building sector and road transport, we observed that they have been slower in reducing emissions, and we did an analysis about a year ago, this climate target plan, where the Commission confirmed 55% target was the right way to go, and an impact assessment. And they concluded that carbon pricing in building area and road transport would be helpful to target cost effectively. So yeah, since then we are working on this aspect. And what can I say? It's what is the simple issue is that if you pay more for the carbon that you use, the fossil fuel, the fossil carbon you use, seen as a good complement. And I have to underline the complement because the regulations on the EU level on energy efficiency for buildings are also strengthened, and we are perfectly aware that there is also a lot of actions on the national level and the local level that are needed also. And in this context, maybe one can mention that EU ETS, as it is, generates now a lot of auctioning revenues to the states, which will be used for climate and energy action. And one important use of these funds is renovating buildings, for example, social housing complexes, etc. So there's already, the link between the existing ETS and building sector. Now, since this proposal came, you know very well that there's been reactions, many, I would say, negative. So it's nice that you have perhaps a bit more positive approach, mainly in concern about social aspect. Will it be more expensive to heat the building? That's energy risk or energy poverty, especially for, of course, the people who have lower incomes. So this aspect of, in addition to now working on a system that can work as a carbon pricing for the EU as a whole, a lot of time we are also now spending on the social, thinking of the social aspects, and our executive vice presidents have already talked about this social fund that would come to support the lower income households, if I say, across all member states in principle. Currently, ETS we have redistribution mainly from which country member states to the lower income member states, and then within those, that's up to them to deal with it. Now, how it will look like in the end, I cannot say, because these are one of the things that we will discuss at this moment. But what is clear is that this social aspect is not forgotten. And of course, the main aim is not that people, let's say, have higher costs, but that there is a speeded up incentive to renovate buildings. So everyone, no matter which income class you are, you can also have the right to live in a housing which is both well isolated and comfortable and well heated, etc., but also with lower cost and lower carbon footprint. For that we need investments, and in this context, for example, all these recovery funds that are right now being approved by the Commission in quite quick pace involve a lot of money, and some of this is for this kind of investments, and also in the normal regional funds, etc. So there are lots of EU money available to do investments now in this area, and of course that creates mainly local jobs, also something that is good for the recovery. But in the short run, of course, there could be increased costs, so we have to think about how that can also be handled for people for that is difficult. But for sure, what we also said in the beginning, there was the belief that the ETS we have now would be expanded by these two sectors. That has been made quite clear on different levels, that what we are talking about is a separate system, sort of parallel emissions trading system, but yeah, because the one we have taken us a long time to have it now well functioning. We have a robust carbon price, and to add two very big sectors, which was more or less double the ETS, would risk, rocking the boat of the existing ETS. So we would think about a parallel system. Of course, what Germany has done is an interesting also observation, and interesting to hear more about that. And yeah, then we have to see how things come. The final decision has not been taken yet. It will be taken on the 14th or a bit before that. I think from that point of view, that's more or less what I can say. It will be easier in a month, then we can present everything, the proposal, the impact assessment, and all the links between this proposal and other EU proposal and other national issues, if there would be a proposal. So yeah, I think that's perhaps my little introduction of more or less 10 minutes.
Right, that's perfect.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you very much, Hans. If I may, I just want to kind of ask a very first question, and actually I'm sure this question will come back at the Q&A. But actually, the European Alliance to Save Energy, we had produced a paper, and we'll show a slide where you could download the paper. And I think we share let's say the anxiety, the fear of many stakeholders, in the sense of not really being sure that the carbon pricing, also it's a very important tool across the board. But I think that the intuition is that it's not going to work properly within the building sector, but not only for the social reasons you outlined, but also because elasticity, I mean, the building sector is not made to kind of really react in an effective way to the elasticity of the carbon pricing. That's one reason. So, and I think my first question will be, so there are a lot of things that are coming up, especially the minimum energy performance standards initiative that was referred in the Renovation Wave. And again, the fear, I think, of many stakeholders is that a parallel system may replace, let's say, a high-level ambitious proposal with regard to minimum energy performance standard that a lot of stakeholders are expecting. So can you tell us first kind of statement or kind of view on how it's going to fit with their, let's say, the other buildings proposal that the Commission wants to make to trigger a higher renovation rate?
Yeah, okay. I think that's a question we also received, for example, for those who are, when it comes to road transport, for those who are very keen and like the regular CO2 standards for new vehicles, that it would be weakened if we would have those our political level. That is not, there is no such link. This is, if we propose this is a complement, and everything has to, well, we are now talking about not a small transition, but the big transition, and all policy instruments need to be as, let's say, ambitious as is possible. So I don't think that is a big risk, at least from what we will propose. Now we know that when things come to the council, and especially in councils, perhaps some member states try to maybe, you know, make things a little bit less strict. Parliament tends to push maybe on the other direction. So in the end, the outcome is not always very far away. But so that's one thing. But okay, you will see how when the proposal comes. But the aim is not to replace one thing with another. When it comes to elasticities, it's true that it's, of course, in the short term, you can just reduce your temperature, and maybe that's not the main aim. But if one sees it a bit of a medium term, I mean, already the fact that one starts talking about it now, and maybe there will be a proposal, that means already there are some years before it will come into place, where, you know, the market can be, well, the signal is given that one should do something about it, and it comes together also with all these funds and all the requirements from the, you know, EU level, for example, that these funds, and of course also national money around, and private also, by the way, that, you know, if one does not invest, there will be more, it will be more expensive, the fossil fuel heating, probably in any case, because gas prices are going up, and for example, I also hear also that. So, but then there's also been now talk, also our president of the commission has said we should maybe not start a system very high prices and all of that, but maybe a bit of a softer start, and that also gives the signal without creating too much you know, social impact in the beginning. But and if you talk about isolation and changing that is something, you know, and changing heat technology, and it's also something that maybe you don't do overnight, but with if you see 5-10 year perspective, you can do quite a lot. And at least we should double the renovation rate we have now. That's also part of the renovation wave. That's also from the EU. But it's a bit of a mix. Then I think another thing that I didn't mention, but you know perfectly well, is of course we have this split incentive problem that sometimes the landlord doesn't have interest. But I think that's also to some extent a short-term problem. It's a problem once you're sitting in your apartment, but once you're looking for a new one, you might probably now more and more ask what would be the heating costs. And if you have a very inefficient apartment, maybe it's more difficult to rent it out, or you can't get so high rent. So somehow the issue is possibly solvable also with the more higher restrictions on requirements on information that are coming now.
All right, okay, very useful. And I see some questions being asked in the Q&A. Please continue to do so. We'll answer to all your questions at the next part of the meeting. And Hans, you say, you know, let's start soft, which I think is a great transition to Sibylle, in the sense that this is my understanding of the German system, at least at the starting phase, that they want to start soft. And so, but then does it have an impact, right? So Sibylle, thanks a lot again for joining. As we say, you know, Germany has been the first mover. So, I mean, it has started 2 years ago or even less. So what lesson could we draw on with regard to what Germany has done, Sibylle? And you have a presentation, and I think you may be on mute, actually.
Yeah, so thank you. So now
right.
I'm trying to share the presentation. I think you should be able to see it now. So thank you
Yeah.
very much for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the insights that we have so far from the German system of CO2 pricing things, and for participating in this important discussion. So I would like to start by giving you a bit of background on the introduction of the German CO2 pricing. And one important element that I would like to highlight here is the need for action that we have in the building sector in Germany. And this need for action can be nicely seen in the graph that you see here, where on the left side in the blue columns, we see the greenhouse gas emissions of the building sector in the past years. And then on the right-hand side, we see the targets that we have in Germany for the building sector according to the Federal Climate Change Act. And now by comparing these two sides of the graph, we can immediately see that greenhouse gas emissions haven't really been reduced in the past years, while the trajectory that is laid out in the Federal Climate Change Act sort of tries, it's clear that there's a very strong decrease and that we have to decrease emissions much more than what has been done in the previous years. So there is a very large need for action and also for fast action. So the Federal Climate Change Act has been introduced in 2019 and has very recently been recast. Actually, it was passed through the Parliament yesterday. And so we have a slightly higher target for 2030 now. This is indicated here in the green lines as opposed to the blue line. And what is new is also that we now have targets also for 2035 and for 2040. And one more point I would like to highlight here is looking at the year 2020. The target for 2020 has not been met for the building sector. The building sector is the only sector in Germany that has not met the target for 2020. And this means also, according to the Federal Climate Change Act, that an action program is going to be introduced, because this happens every time that the annual emission budget is exceeded. So we have an urgent need for action, and also we have a dynamic situation in the building sector right now. And in this context, the carbon pricing scheme was introduced in Germany. It was first introduced in 2019 in the context of the Climate Action Program 2030. The Climate Action Program 2030 is a set of policy measures with the aim of supporting the trajectory towards meeting the 2030 targets. And the CO2 pricing is one key element of this climate action program, but the climate action program as such also contains many more measures, not only for the building sector, but also for other sectors. And the carbon pricing scheme covers both the buildings and the transport sector. The legal implementation of the CO2 pricing scheme in Germany is in the Fuel Emissions Trading Act. And so already the name suggests that this is implemented as an emissions trading system. However, we have a fixed price phase until 2025. So you can see the prices from 2021 to 2025, which range between 25 euros per ton up to 55 euros per ton. I will come to this hybrid scheme of having a fixed price and an emission trading scheme. So the CO2 pricing is in place only since January 21. So this is still a very recent scheme that we have in Germany, but as it was already, as it has been discussed in 2019, there are studies already analyzing the impact. And I would like to show you the results of some of those studies, sort of to discuss the question, to what extent can carbon pricing contribute to meeting the ambitious 2020 targets for the building sector in Germany. For that, I would like to show you the results of studies looking at the gap that we have for meeting the 2030 target. On the one hand, this was calculated in modeling work without having the climate action program. This is the left bar. Then it was calculated with the climate action program, middle bar, and then you can see the target for 2030, which is now 67 megatons. And what you can see when looking at the gap, so the light blue part of the columns, is that without the climate action program, there was a considerable gap for meeting the target of around 25 megatons. This was the main reason for introducing the climate action program. But now the interesting part is that looking at the modeling work, including the climate action program, this gap is only closed up to at most one half. So there's a difference between the studies, this is shown here, but there is still a considerable gap remaining even with the climate action program, including the carbon pricing scheme. So even with ambitious ambitious CO2 pricing and further measures, there is still an important gap. And now to look into more detail of how part of the gap is closed, I would like to give you some numbers of the modeling work where two scenarios have been calculated for CO2 pricing. One is a price pathway of reaching 180 euros per ton in 2080, and the second scenario assumes 120 euros per ton in 2030. So with those two price trajectories and together the whole package of measures that is introduced in the climate action program for the building sector, we show here which measures close which part of the gap. And so looking first at the cross-cutting measures, which is basically the CO2 pricing and the reduction of the electricity price, which is right now one of the elements of revenue recycling of the German CO2 pricing. We can see that we induced emission reduction of about 4.5 tons and slightly less in the scenario with the lower carbon pricing. Same time, we have financial subsidies as being the main driver with around 5 megatons. And then we can see that regulations only play a minor role because the main regulatory measure included in the climate action program is a ban on the installation of non-fuel boilers by 2026. So there is still more room for regulations to come in, and then a small part also on information and advice measures. So what is important here, what can be seen from this, is that even with the carbon pricing scheme, we do not meet the targets, and we do need more complementary measures in order to be able to meet the targets. Now I would like to give some more insights in the specific design of the program of the carbon pricing scheme in Germany. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have a hybrid approach. So this means that we have an emission trading system, but we have a fixed price base until 2025. And we then have a price corridor in 2026 between 55 and 65 euros. And then from 2027, it is foreseen to have a cap and trade system, unless it is decided in 2025 to continue with the price corridor. What you can see in the graph here is the price of oil and gas in 2019, and then the add-on that we get on the price. And so we see that with the introduction in 2021, this is a small add-on with the 25 euros per ton. Then this increases until 2025. And now in 2030, we do not know what will be the price, because for now, this is supposed to be part of a cap and trade system where the price is then decided on the market. And what I show here is the price that has been used in the calculation for the German NECP, which is a considerably higher price than the trajectories that we showed before. So what can be learned from this? We have the situation where we have a fixed price, which is known, and then we have the unknown price until 2030, which is in a sense unfortunate in terms of having building owners to invest in low carbon technologies. And so it's unknown what the price will be. And the only thing that we see right now is this sort of soft price path until 2025. And then giving the price to the market is, of course, a short time frame with regard to the long lifetimes of building elements. We only have from 2027 until 2030 in order to meet the target. Now, the next point I would like to highlight regarding the design of the German program is the question of landlords and tenants and rented buildings. So right now, all the costs of CO2 pricing can be passed to the tenants in the German scheme, although there has been much discussion about splitting the costs between landlords and tenants. This is a very important question in Germany because we have more than half of the households living in rented dwellings, and generally the distribution of the costs between landlord and tenants very much influences, on one hand, the impact and also the distributional effects of carbon pricing in the building sector. There was a discussion going on basically since the introduction of carbon pricing. There has been a kind of seemed to be an agreement in May, but it turned out that no, in the negotiations, no agreement could be reached so far. So currently the state is that all costs can be passed on to tenants, but this is something that is still in the discussion in Germany. With that, sorry, I would like to come sort of to the main conclusions or the main lessons that can be learned from the recent introduction of the carbon pricing scheme in Germany. So one important point is that the building sector faces a multitude of heterogeneous barriers, and they cannot be addressed alone by carbon pricing. Also, a point is the time frame. So giving the emission reduction trajectory that we have in a short time frame, And by contrast, the long lifetime of building components, a cap and trade system alone cannot drive the transition. The third point I would like to make is on the distribution between landlords and tenants, that this needs to be solved such that carbon pricing can incentivize low carbon investment also in rented buildings. I mean, this was mentioned before, on the long term, this can guide through the energy costs into decisions to rent the building. But if the carbon pricing scheme is to contribute to the 2030 target, it would be important to solve this issue of distributing the costs. So maybe the main conclusion, CO2 pricing is a very important element of the policy mix for buildings, but strong complementary measures are needed as well in order to shape the transition. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. It's very enlightening. So the very first question before we move to Louise and back to the presentation. So clearly we see from the presentation, it's not a silver bullet what the German system is about to decarbonize the building sector. So what's your view, and do you have any concern about the EU kind of initiative? Also, we don't have yet the proposal, right? But what's and positive or negative kind of first reaction of this initiative?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not concerned about the introduction of carbon pricing for the building sector at all. I think it is a very important element. The only concern would be what has already been discussed by Hans Bergman, if carbon pricing leads to the fact that other policies are not introduced as much as they would have been without carbon pricing. So as long as it is supported by complementary policies, strong complementary policies, I'm not at all concerned about carbon pricing. I do think it's a very important element of the policy mix.
Very clear, and I'm sure we'll come back to that point during the discussion time. All right, moving to our last, but not least speaker, Louise Sunderland. So you have actually drafted a super interesting piece of work about carbon pricing in the building sector. So, right, obviously your insights are very much welcome. So Louise, you have also some few slides, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Sorry, jumping slides. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to give a quick overview to some work I've been doing with colleagues Sam Thomas and Marion Santini in RAP. And I think probably the title of our paper, which is Pricing is Just the Icing, gives you the overall message for this whole presentation. I think it does chime exactly with what Sibylle has been reporting from the German experience. So first of all, we all know this context, but I do like to always show this slide, which just I think really illustrates the challenge we have ahead of us in the next sort of 9 or 10 years. The building sector has to reduce emissions by 60% to be in line with our 2030 targets, and we are not on track. And I think this graph really does show that we are not on track. The way the Commission Impact Assessment sees us achieving the 60% reduction is interesting, actually. It sees an 18% reduction in final energy demand, but really the big lifting being done by decarbonising our heating fuels. So we see at the bottom here of these two bars, a huge reduction in fossil fuel use, about more than 50% reduction, or almost all oil and coal disappearing, and gas use reducing by 40%. And that is picked up, that some of that demand is picked up by an increase of electrification, which you can see at the top of this chart. So these are all the numbers, these are all the impact assessments, the projections. But what does that mean on the ground? And I really think this is important whenever we're talking about a renovation, a buildings policy framework, to remember what it means on the ground. It means millions and millions of European building owners and building users doing these three things in these pictures. The first is renovating their buildings to reduce energy demand. And this is actually a picture of my house last month, having external wall insulation installed to it. The next, it means them replacing their fossil fuel heating systems. I will choose a heat pump, which is why this is illustrated here. And also, I think, as you can see from the impact assessment, with that increase in electrification, heat pumps will play a huge role. And then the third part is, of course, if we're electrifying our heating, we need to get some demand side flexibility in there. So this is a picture of my thermal store, my water tank, which I will be increasing size of when I introduce my heat pump. So I think just really important when we're then thinking about this framework to remember that's our goal. And what do we need, therefore, to enable those millions of Europeans to do those things? I'm going to call on the age-old, but perhaps not very academic policy framework, the carrot, the stick, and the tambourine. So, of course, we need the carrots. We need the support available to those building owners and building unit users, which comes in the form of funding and finance, practical assistance and renovation programs delivered at a local level through one-stop shops. And we need obviously the technical assistance, therefore, from the European level to enable both member states and local level actors like local authorities to build up those programs. I think there are lots of opportunities in the upcoming Fit for 55 package to increase this support. We've talked, I think we're expecting improvements to EPCs, and I'd really like to see a better introduction of building renovation passports in the EPBD later this year. One-stop shops I've already mentioned. An increase in the Article 7 target will be really important, because we do know that Article 7 delivers a huge amount of energy efficiency into the building sector. So that's an incredibly important element of the package, and more dedicated EU funds for renovation. We have a lot of funds at EU level that can be used for renovation, but actually not many that must be used for renovation. And I think that's a really important distinction, because the building sector does have to compete with other arguably simpler sectors for investment at present. The next very see the Commission proposing to introduce performance standards things. You know, these standards can create that regulatory backstop that I think we need to ensure that buildings are renovated. But also, very, very importantly, they produce this signal. You know, these are regulations that, when we see them introduced around the world, are introduced with a relatively long time scale between announcement and enforcement. And that long time scale allows the signalling and the clarity for each of the building owners to know where their building has to go in this decarbonisation trajectory. And obviously, that can signal them into these support framework that we've scaled up. There are other regulatory measures I think that we could certainly be looking to as well: mandatory renewable heating and cooling targets, fossil fuel phase outs, and others. And so, where does pricing fit within this? I do see pricing as the tambourine. It is the supporting instrument in the band, and I could go into a very complex metaphor around, you know, how the tambourine stands at the front of the stage and waves to get our attention. I won't spend too much time doing that, but I think you know, that does give an indication that the tambourine is, I think, the supporting measure to these important elements. And the last point to make about this framework as well is on timing. We very clearly need the supporting measures to come first. And so I think, quite surprised about, you know, how the debate on the Fit for 55 package has centered quite a lot around carbon pricing. And I would really like to see the debate being much, much more around the enabling measures that need to come in before the burdens of regulation and pricing. So then what is the actual role of pricing within this framework? What can it do? What can't it do? So pricing does support the investment case for renovation, particularly for energy efficiency. It also helps to rebalance fossil and electricity prices, which is a very, very important thing that we need to address if we are, as the Commission Impact Assessment sees, going to electrify a lot of heating. At the moment here, as you can see on this graph, you don't need to see the detail. What you need to see is the difference between the blue bars and the red bars, and they show the difference between the levies and taxes on electricity and gas prices. And you can very clearly see there is only one country in Europe that places more burdens of levies and taxes on their gas bills than they do on their electricity bills. So an introduction of carbon pricing can start to, you know, level that out and make the case for electrification of heating at a household level or a bill level a little bit easier. And of course, carbon pricing generates revenues. But what doesn't it do? And I think it is clear that alone, and I think this point has already been made twice, I won't dwell on it, alone carbon pricing doesn't drive renovations at acceptable price levels. Price levels would have to be incredibly high for a carbon price, the introduction of a carbon price alone, to really trigger deep renovation. And it also doesn't overcome all of these practical barriers that Sibylle mentioned in her conclusion slide there, you know, that are everything from access to capital to the hugely disaggregated nature of a building sector, through to the split incentives between landlord and tenants. And there are risks as well, and I think we really do need to highlight the risks associated with introducing carbon pricing. Carbon pricing raises bills for disproportionately for low-income households. I think we do all recognise this now, and certainly there's been a lot of Germans illustrating this, how we might mitigate that. But this chart just really shows the introduction of a carbon tax as a share of households' disposable income and the impact on different income deciles. To the left of the chart, the lower income deciles, and you can clearly see the impact of the carbon price is higher. What's really important there is also that these lower income households have the least ability to decarbonize in response to that price. So we really need to be very, very place a lot of attention on this risk, because what the result is that those households ration energy, and households on the lowest incomes in energy poverty, as we know, are already under consuming and bearing the health impacts and other negative impacts of that. So there, clarifying a little bit what the role of carbon pricing is within this European framework, we do have various different options for introducing the price signal. The first is simply to raise effort sharing regulation targets. And this, you would be forgiven for saying, is not a carbon pricing mechanism, and I would agree. But actually what we do see is those member states that have the most challenging effort sharing targets, which are on the right-hand side of this graph here, do tend to introduce national carbon pricing goods. So just by raising ESR targets, actually, we do encourage, of course, more comprehensive renovation packages, policy packages to be introduced at national level, and they very often include carbon pricing. So there's our first option. Our second option is the Energy Tax Directive reform to introduce a minimum carbon energy tax for all member states to implement. The third is, I think, the German, very, very similar to the German model that Sibylle has just outlined, which is a separate emissions trading scheme with a firm price corridor and within this option, obviously, as Sibylle has said, the price is controlled to avoid the shocks, and an escalator is created that allows building users to decarbonize and access the support that's in place and that has been scaled up over time. And really, it's a carbon tax in all but name. What it does do is give us the future policy option to relax some of those price controls and perhaps introduce a cap and trade system in time. And the final option that we have open to us, I think, has already, perhaps been taken off the table, but it's important to remind why. And that would be to enlarge the existing ETS by the inclusion of the emissions from the building sector, or to introduce a standalone ETS. And the difference here is obviously that would be a full cap and trade system. And that is a highly risky option. Obviously, the key feature of the cap and trade is the price is not controlled in the way that a carbon price is. And so we would risk swiftly rising prices and price shocks for consumers. And the other point I think important to say here as well is this is the only option in which the climate architecture shifts from the ESR to these. And important in that is that the risk of non-compliance is therefore placed on the users. In all of these other options, it requires increased ESR targets and the scope and the building's emission to remain in the scope of the ESR. And as I've said, what that does is obviously encourage member states to introduce comprehensive national frameworks themselves. And so just the last point I'll leave you on, and Sibylle talked about revenues in the German model, but we talk about introducing the price in the price, however we the aim of carbon tax is to reduce carbon, and so should the revenues. And I'm very interested to see the announcement from Vice President Timmermans a couple of weeks ago about the Social Climate Action Fund. It might be very interesting to maybe raise that in the discussion, find out a little bit more about that. But I do think these revenues do need to be used. Of course, I think we need short-term assistance to mitigate the impact on bills of the most burdened, remembering, of course, that energy poverty in Europe will have been made worse by the COVID crisis. But really, in the long term, the body of these revenues do need to go to decarbonisation of the building sector, focused, of course, on those that are most burdened first. And I will leave it there.
All right, Louise, thank you. It's a brilliant presentation, a lot of food for thought. When I look at your presentation and when I also listen to other speakers, the first question to you is that de facto and realistically, a carbon pricing system for buildings looks more like a carbon tax, also it doesn't have this word, than a real cap and trade system, which is really what ETS is about. Would you agree with this statement, and do you think it's more realistic and efficient to conceive something which look more like a carbon tax for the building sector as a way to leverage carbon pricing?
Well, I think there are two parts to that. I think the first part is that, I think practically a controlled price introduced early is our only option if we are looking to introduce carbon pricing soon. I think also, very simply, the big difference between a carbon tax and a cap and trade is that the carbon tax sets the price and therefore can communicate the price. That's important because it gives, exactly as Sibylle says, gives decision makers at the building level a very clear idea of their investment case, and at the other end of the scale, it also, I think, is it's easier to protect lower income households from price shocks that might happen in a cap and trade. So I do think, sort of from practical and also kind of signaling means, then the carbon price option is at least in this decade really more realistic.
All right. Okay, super. Thank you. No, again, very inspiring presentation. And we have a couple of questions on the chat, and I will read the questions, and I have some as well, which I will add to. So yeah, thanks to the speaker to put on their video. So the first actually question is, and that you could see as well, is from Thomas Pellerin-Carlin from Not Europe. And which is, what do you think will be the impact of your ETS2 proposal on tenants, which back to the split incentive issue you alluded to. So Hans, any reaction to this first, or any response to the question?
Well, I think other speakers also mentioned this issue, which is of course well known. I think there's a whole spectrum of different types of ways people live. One can react. Of course, if you have your own house, probably the easiest to do something. And but you might not funds, then you have maybe you own your apartment, but you have to agree with all your, at least most of your co-owners. Or you have your land you are renting, but you're very serious and good landlord who wants to really have best efficiency because they are maybe public or maybe a serious big company, or then you might have the not so serious. So it's a whole spectrum of issues, and I think there's no one size fits all for everything. But what I mentioned is that, of course, if we from one day to another have an increase in price, that's of course a bit difficult to do something about it. But that can happen also today. Now gas prices are going up, as I said, and because of the market. So this is more about medium to longer term. Also, those who rent to move eventually, and then they can make sure, or try to make sure, that they move into where the energy efficiency and the cost of heating, etc., is more efficient. But yes, I think that we have to look at it in a broader sense, and maybe the fact that there are some problems somewhere shouldn't prevent action for the very segment of the buildings and the homes. And you know, we also talk about offices, and let's not forget about that we are, you know, talking about that where action is needed. But of course, it's this let's say, especially if we talk about lower income people, that's more of an issue. Maybe if they have a bad landlord, it's even more of an issue.
Yeah. All right, it's super clear. I would actually broaden the question and direct to Sibylle and Louise. I mean, Sibylle, I think the German system has tried to address the issue by focusing on the heating producers. And I don't know the nitty-gritty of the regulation in Germany, but how this question by Thomas is being addressed? Do you think the system is the right one to address it in Germany?
The question of landlords and tenants in Germany is being addressed in a sense that when the CO2 pricing was introduced, it was also introduced that this is going to be taken care of, but this taken care of is taking a long time and is difficult in the negotiations. But in principle, it is foreseen that the costs are split between landlords and tenants. And I think there are two important parts to this issue. One is the question of distributional effects of sort of protecting low-income households. And the other one is really about the impact that the policy instrument has. So it is a climate policy instrument, and it's important that it has a direct impact. And of course, I share the views of Hans Bergman that this can be triggered, or that it can go down to the renting market at some point. At the same time, there are renting markets where people just need houses and where they pay anything. And so there, I think it's very difficult that carbon pricing can have an impact on retrofit, on the exchange of heating systems. And so it will be interesting to see how this evolves, how the discussion evolves in Germany. But in principle, the idea is to get to some kind of a split of the costs.
Louise, also may I add one thing, which is Hans alluded to the fact that indeed the building sector is not only residential, you also have the commercial, the industrial buildings where this issue may be, at least socially, slightly easier to address. So is it a way forward to kind of maybe focus a carbon pricing system more on the non-residential sector, or is it a completely wrong approach from your point of view?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I just struggle to be honest to know how we would do that, and maybe others have a better idea. But of course, if we are introducing a carbon price on the polluter pays principle, and we're adding it to fuels, then, you know, dividing up the portion of those fuels that are used in different building sectors will be very different. Obviously, you know, the buildings are complex as well. They're not single use. You know, we have a lot of different, you know, mixed use buildings. So I think that would be challenging. But I do take the point that that if carbon pricing is about improving the investment case, then of course for corporates that, you know, that becomes clearer and easier to integrate into their investment models. I would just say I think the same argument as I think has been made, and the same experience we have had in minimum energy performance standards, where, you know, the regulatory risk identified by not complying with that future regulation has been more quickly noticed and responded to in the commercial sector. This is certainly what we're seeing from the UK through the introduction of minimum energy performance standards. That isn't to say, however, that those standards can't be effective and have been introduced and are being introduced in many areas of the world, in fact, for residential buildings. So I think it is about thinking who are the actors and the decision makers, and what are the policies that most effectively can support them to renovate.
All right, thank you. Very, 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 very useful. Now, more the political picture from Adrian Joyce, EU-ASE. well, basically a straightforward question from her for Brussels environment, which is what about the political weight of, and more than the political weight, how likely member states will support such proposal, right? So Adrian is saying that both Germany and Denmark seems to be supportive, but not the rest of countries. What's your feeling, Hans, about it? And then I would have a question to Louise and Sibylle related to that. So Hans first.
Well, as I said in the beginning, the enthusiasm wasn't enormous when this came up first on various sides. When it comes to the member states, I would say we have here, sometimes there are these informal discussions and all of that, where we hear more or less what they think at this moment in time. I think, okay, not many have said at any cost we will vote yes to this. I think a bit of skepticism, but many also, I think, would have said that they want to see the whole package, this proposal, if it comes, and the whole package, and then make a overall assessment. So I don't think it's dead upon arrival, but it's maybe not the one that would be most easiest to get through either. And where again, I think this social aspect is absolutely key, because that has been raised by many. Then there's perhaps other element like existing carbon taxation, or have it in member states. Some of them will think how they will deal with that, but yeah, the usual negotiations. Depends also, Parliament, I think, a bit perhaps more hesitant than one. Normally they always like everything that in the direction, but sometimes there was also a bit of a concern here. So we'll see. But I think that's also why our president has sort of hinted that we should, if we go this way, we slowly and explain well, and also make sure that the aim is not to increase cost, but make something positive out of this and give the right signals and combine it with a lot of investments and etc.
Okay, super. So not easy, but we have to see. Actually, Sibylle, I'm not sure you have an answer to my question, but from your point of view, how important it is for Germany to get this, to get a European carbon prices for buildings, right? Since they have their own system, and I guess they want to see a compatible system at EU level. But how important it is for them from your point of view?
From my point of view, in Germany now, having the carbon price, also having discussions of increasing the carbon pricing that we currently, I think the key signals that Germany needs from Europe in order to get the transition of the building sector is rather on the regulatory side, in a sense. But still, I think, I mean, what you also just said, I think the signaling also of carbon pricing is important, because if we assume that the building sector is transformed, that we have heat pumps, that we have higher efficiency, and all of this at a very high level, then it's important that these investments, all the investments that need to be made, are actually profitable to some extent. And so I think carbon pricing is extremely important, maybe not sort of to induce and drive the investments, but also to have the signaling that those investments that are necessary, that can be driven also by regulations, are actually profitable.
All right. And Louise, what about the UK? I don't think I've seen any similar initiative from the UK, but and plus ETS has to be kind of reformed somehow. But so is there any policy about having carbon pricing for buildings in the UK, as far as you know?
You have definitely.
And I know
I was going to say, you've definitely caught me out there. Despite living in the UK, I work in Brussels, okay. But I think, as far as I understand, there is discussion. I think fair to say that the whole UK policy framework is still in discussion. Let's just say we are expecting a heat strategy for buildings very soon, which may contain proposals we don't know. Obviously, in the UK, we've been distracted for some time now by the Brexit process. So I think fair to say a lot of the policy for climate change in the building sector in particular has been delayed.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I know it's not your area, but yeah, absolutely. Since you are living in the UK, I ask you the question. Now we have a question from Felix, which I guess to answer about, not sure exactly what the question means, but it's about renewable stakeholders and the support that they have to bring. Right. So and about any specific area where you need such support. Don't know, Hans, if you want to answer to this question.
Well, I think it's just what is always good for stakeholders that if they can say that, give positive examples of where one can, for example, combine investments, generate jobs, and you have a better, for example, in the building sector, combine better comfort and less costs, for example, or in general, the positive messaging, because there are many who only see problems in this transition we are in. So, and if it's more concrete, like Louise showed very concrete pictures, I think it's good sometimes that we are going concrete and not only talk about percentages and stuff like that, because that is a bit abstract. And also what one can do in different situations and maybe different parts of Europe, because sometimes we are different when it comes to climate and when it comes to availability of, for example, sun or wind or whatever, and also different income levels, etc. So I think good examples are always good. Okay.
Thank you. Right. So here a question which I have to the three of you about the price range. Actually, here someone put 55 euros a ton to 65, which for me looks a bit weak or a bit low. But what you're feeling, and what actually will be a reasonable price for a ton of CO2 in the building sector today and tomorrow? Maybe starting with Louise and Sibylle, and then Hans.
I think perhaps it's a difficult question to ask coming from my perspective, which is that the price is just one part of many new things we need. So clearly, if we have strong regulation, we have strong support, we have increased ESR targets, we have increased Article 7 targets, and all those things we talk about, then the contribution that the price needs to make might be lower. Without all of that, then, as I've already said, I think the price is going to need to be incredibly high to achieve. We need to achieve. So I would rather start with the question of how can we get all the rest of that right, and then how much does the price need to top up the investment case? That would be the way I would approach that question. I haven't to 65, but to some extent, I think it's an impossible question to answer if we don't know what the rest of the framework looks like.
All right, very clear. Honest, Sibylle.
Yes, so I agree to what Louise just said, and I think that 55 to 65 comes from the German price corridor of 2026. I mean, in the slides, I showed sort of the add-on of the CO2 pricing on the energy price in Germany, and we could see that the price increases slightly, but this is not sort of such a big increase. It's sort of the order of price fluctuations that we see regularly. So I think one question is, on the one hand, can a price in general be sufficient in order to reduce those investments? Related to what Louise says, it depends very much on the fact that we have supporting carbon pricing on the complementary policies. And in general, if the price is sufficient, I think it's clear that looking at least the situation in Germany with the prices that we have currently, this price range is insufficient in order to have really to induce large investments in energy efficiency and decarbonizing heating. So we need higher prices, but it depends a lot on the complementary policies. So I agree fully to what Louise said.
All right, and last but not least, Hans, and may I ask you, Hans, whether we could anticipate the Commission proposal to come with actually some specific values for carbon prices?
So, Once, if I can just take the question a bit broader, I think this carbon pricing has been discussed a lot in the world, and I think, for example, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, everybody says that we need a carbon pricing in the world to, decarbonize in a cost-efficient way, and that's why this is also such a big topic now in the next COP, this international new way to create some sort of international carbon market. And the aim is not to punish people, but the aim is to give the right signal users of these energies, and also the right incentives for those who can invest to make go in other direction when it comes to efficiency, renewable, and what have you. So saying in that context, I think what I said, in the particular context we are in, I think it's more the direction, which is probably important, because people probably act both on what they see, but also what they expect in the future. And, therefore, like the German system has maybe a slow starter, but the signal is clear for those who think a little bit ahead. It's clear what might be a useful investment. And if you make an investment with a 10 or 20 year payback, you don't look at the carbon price of today, but what will it be later? So that's more or less my reply to that. What our price will be, I cannot say, but what I think is a little bit linked to what Louise said, we have with cap and trade, we have to be careful with the price shocks and all of that, which I agree. Now, what we have already in the current ETS is we have market stability reserve, for example. It's a system whereby, okay, now we have it more working in the direction of perhaps getting increasing prices, but it can also work in the other way of adding allowances to the market if the price would go high, and we also have a short-term price mechanism. So there are different ways one can, add to the cap and trade system, so it's not completely left to the market, but interventions can be done if prices would go, outside of some sort of ranges that can be either fixed or relative to previous times. And maybe also, if I may say, on this carbon taxation, as many of you probably know, the energy tax directive for many years, or the negotiations took many years, and in the end it was withdrawn because it didn't work. Now that was EU-28, maybe today it would have been maybe a little bit different discussion, but who knows. But anyway, that's not, that attempt has been made. And well, we'll see where it's going. In fact, that was already an attempt a long time ago to have a European carbon tax, but it didn't work also. That's why ETS came in and bit as a alternative, because also we have this unanimity requirement in the EU, which makes taxation decisions difficult to agree on.
Yeah. Actually, just maybe to kind of close the question about carbon price, in the sense of carbon price, right? The price to carbon, the price of ton of carbon. More questions are coming saying that basically, it creates tension with regard to who is going to be exempted. And it's true that when you look at this, what happened with ETS, it has taken 10 years to kind of sort out, the allowance, the free allowance issues. So, and it seems that, the same kind of discussion also is happening in Germany about who has to be exempted. That's a question from Henning. Then a question also from Thomas Novak about, the kind of policy sensibility of kind of talking about a fixed price and also going to a increased price because of government's discussion. So, right. So what is the policy price to pay, right? For and the risk that it creates loopholes. The fact to have, to kind of plan and to have fixed carbon price by regulation, even if you increase and you try to play with it.
I see many questions in this. It's difficult to read that and listen to.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah.
I see that.
So that's the question from Henning and Thomas Novak.
So maybe who you want to reply?
Right, very quickly to you. I think because it's to you and Sibylle and anyone who wants to reply actually. Otherwise we could move, right? Because it's true that. So I give you 5 seconds to respond if you want. Otherwise we move to other questions.
No, I don't know. I see Thomas is saying we could have a carbon price and that will solve everything. And I mean that's kind of the economist's dream, that we have a economic incentive and then everything else is that solves everything. Of course, the reality is a bit more complicated than that, so we need a combination. But exactly which is the right combination, probably people have different views.
Oh. All right. Okay. Now let's move maybe to another question. That's from Andreas Graf from Agora, which basically is saying that, and that's to you, Louise. You say you focus on the sequencing of support policies ahead of regulatory and pricing policies. And I think what Andreas alluded to is that a lot of money has been put in the machine, let's say, to renovate buildings with no necessarily a great impact, right? So, and plus we may have an issue about who is going to pay for it, right? So basically he's saying, okay, is it not sometimes an excuse to delay regulation and pricing?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And obviously, we can't subsidize our way out of this. You know, we do not, there are not enough public funds very clearly to be able to, you know, provide very high levels of subsidy to every building owner, sufficient to get them to do this, you know, because they're delighted with how much money they're getting from the government. And unfortunately, I think, unfortunately or not unfortunately, but to date, that kind of has been at the core of a lot of our renovation programs. We have offered the able to pay building owners quite high subsidies to induce them to take action. I think given the clear reality we have before us now, we have to look very clearly at a different use of our public funding. So not just expanding publicly funded public funding exponentially, but actually look at where it's most needed. And I think it is most needed very clearly for those households that are least able to resource a renovation themselves, to invest themselves, but also are not, for whom private sector finance is not suitable. We need to focus our public funds there. We also need to focus our public funds on unsticking the sticking points in the renovation supply chains and the renovation pipeline of projects. So, you know, innovation spending, we always talk about this as a good use of public funds, but clearly, you know, industrialized renovation models, support for the increase of the enabling measures like one-stop shops, those uses can then multiply the effect of the public funding, because of course then it enables able to pay building owners to go in and get access to private sector finance they may not be aware of or able to get hold of otherwise. So I'm definitely not calling for a kind of exponential, you know, we can't kind of publicly fund our way out of this situation, but I think very clearly calling for a redirection of our use of public funds, particularly if we're going to bring in regulatory and pricing measures that will impact the poorest first and the poorest most. Then we need to redirect our public funds to those households. And really, you know, those households I think have been quite often last on the decarbonisation agenda. You know, we have been, particularly with you know, heat pumps and deep renovation models, looking to those households who are most able to pay and then can get the market moving. But I think we need to refocus that and really start looking at decarbonising for those who are least able first.
All right. Okay. And linked to that, and that's a question to the three speakers, and I think it's in some question of the chat. So you all agree that ETS or, you know, whatever carbon pricing is to be an additional supportive complementary measure to regulation, right? And regulation coming at EU level from the EPBDs, EED, you name them. Now, my question is, if we want to draw an ideal regulatory framework, what do you think should be those regulatory measures, right? Because I mean, Louise, and you say, right, we need minimum energy performance standard, but that could mean a lot of things. So do we need to have, mandatory renovation milestone? Do we need to phase out worse energy performing buildings? So what are, from your point of view, the best complementary measure to a carbon pricing that will really drive renovation in Europe? Maybe starting with you, Hans, and then Sibylle and Louise. And beyond the funding support that Sibylle alluded.
On this question, I'm a little bit in an awkward situation that it's my colleagues who work in DG Energy who are experts on this and work on this. It's their legislation, and I'm not very, good on the details. But I think there you will have to see what comes up. But for sure, there will be proposals to make this existing regulation more in line with the increased targets. But I still want to say one thing, and I think not forget about the private finance, let's say capital. There is now, the banks, the whole private capital market is really looking for investments in the green and let's say, green area, if I say it like that. And there's a huge amount of money available, and financing exists where they house and then they pay everything and then they take part of the benefit with you. I know that in Brussels, for example, you can get the cogeneration plant installed in your apartment building. They pay everything, and the only effect is that you get some money every month back from this company for the next 5 years or something. So it's win-win. And given that there's less things that more and more these banks are not allowed to finance, let's say, fossil fuel investment, they look desperately for other things to finance. So I think we will see more and more such creative financing, which can also benefit people, for example, living as tenants in housing projects or whatever. All right, thank you, Hans. Sibylle?
Yes, so before coming to the regulations, maybe just to briefly come back also to the question of Thomas on economic theory. So, I mean, in economic theory, you may be right, but I think this deviates, sort of the reality deviates even more from economic theory in the case of an upstream system. So if we have an emission trading upstream system, the entities that present the certificates are not even the entities that have to take action. This is even more difficult, that a cap and trade system would really lead us to the target. So if we put a cap and trade system climate targets in Germany, so really fixing a fixed cap on the climate targets, this would lead to prices that are really incredibly high. And also it would mean that people can just not use heating anymore, and it's sort of a basic need. So I think it's really, in that case of heating, it's impossible to solve this just through a cap and trade system. And then also your other question regarding the raising the prices. So as I said, I think the prices are too low. So I totally agree that it's necessary to raise the prices. Okay, but then coming to the regulations, I mean, from the scenarios in at least in Germany, we get a quite clear idea what is needed, and what is needed clearly is a phase out of fossil fuel heating and an increase of the retrofit and also of the depth of retrofit. And so, I mean, if the measures come from the EU level or the national level, what is basically needed is stronger regulations, phasing out fossil fuels. We have a very weak approach to phasing out oil boilers starting in 26, but with exceptions, and also extended to gas, and sort of removing exemptions, and the same for retrofitting. So minimum standards, I think, are one key element here.
Very clear. Okay, Louise, and actually just then we enter into the very last comment from the three of you. So Louise, back to the regulatory questions, and also any question on the chat that we have not answered and that you would like to pick, please, and any concluding remark.
Yes, thank you. I will also, if I may, just come back to Thomas's point. I feel like we're all ganging up on him now, but I think he was intentionally, I think, trying to encourage this debate. So I agree totally with Sibylle's point, but also I would pick up on the other point that Thomas said. The second point, which is, we simply use the revenues to reduce the burdens. Now, even with an economic model, nobody really quite knows how to do that well. And therefore, it is even less practical in reality, on the ground. And it could become a very bureaucratic and burdensome activity to try and make sure those revenues go back exactly to those people who need them most, and those that are burdened are not missed. And I would encourage you to read our report, actually, because the whole middle section of the report is about who will be burdened. And it isn't just those on lower incomes. There are different burdens between countries, there are different burdens between income levels, and there are different burdens between actually individual households and individual buildings and energy users within those income levels. So it's complex, and I think that's where some of those economic theories kind of slightly cloud reality. On the regulation point, yes, I mean, the other piece of work that I've been doing, the other piece of policy that I've been doing a lot of work in over the last year is minimum energy performance standards, and I really do think that these should be the centerpiece of our revisions to the framework. How they should be introduced, which I think was, Antoine, was your question, was that I think for these to be most useful, they need to be introduced early in their full visibility. And what I mean by that is that they need to extend to all relevant sectors early. They don't necessarily, the compliance deadlines don't all necessarily need to be the same in different sectors. We might see, for example, the commercial sector coming under a compliance deadline earlier than the residential sector, but we need to have visibility early that those compliance deadlines will be in place for each sector. We can introduce either phased standards for each building sector, so the standards that move buildings up through the performance levels, or we could be brave and introduce deep renovation standards. And we do have models designed, certainly of the progressive standards in Scotland and in France, that we can look to for inspiration. And also we have the deep renovation model as proposed by the French Citizens Convention on Climate, which is a very interesting model that I think we could consider. And then finally, I think there is a question around whether minimum energy performance standards drive fabric improvements, so energy efficiency, and therefore it would be an energy performance standard. And I think given our energy performance certificates across Europe are more often energy performance standard than carbon performance standards, there is a question whether we use minimum energy performance standards to drive just the fabric improvement, in which case we would definitely need fossil fuel phase out policies that really combine, or we look to introducing a carbon standard, perhaps through revising the EPC frameworks. But I do think in that way we can create this kind of centerpiece, the clarity that this regulation creates for the whole stock.
All right, thank you, Louise. Thank you very much. We have only 1 minute max left. Hans, any concluding remark or questions that you want to answer before we close?
No, I think maybe one thing just to mention is on the one thing I think you didn't mention, but on ETS, we know that all the that are heated by district heating, or at least many, are covered by the EU-ASE if they're using fossil fuel. So we already have maybe up to 30% of buildings covered by the EU-ASE and carbon pricing. So one could also see that extending it to this other would be sort of equal issue. Then also electrification is of course a very important aspect, both for the road transport sector and for the building sector, and therefore the involvement of the power sector is so crucial. They have promised that they can deliver this electricity in a low carbon or no carbon way. So there is also, of course, lots of investments needed, and there's a whole package. So this distinction between one or the other is a little bit artificial. It's just like road transport is now covered by the effort sharing, but when the car is become electric and the electricity comes from a gas plant, it's suddenly from EU-ASE. So yeah, things are coming more and more together, and with more electrification, we are getting a united system. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Hans. Sibylle, any final point from your side before we turn to Christian?
Yeah, maybe briefly commenting on one question, the question of electricity prices versus gas prices and heat pumps. I fully agree, and this was also what Louise showed in her slides, that if electricity price is so much higher than gas prices, it's impossible to get heat pumps, which is a key technology. So I fully agree, and I fully agree the carbon pricing is very important in that. So we discussed so much about complementary policies. Just once more, I do think carbon pricing is very important exactly for that. But we still need the complementary policies.
All right, great concluding point. Thank you very much. I mean, to Hans, Louise, and Sibylle, let me applaud you. Well done. Virtually, unfortunately, but you know, was very great insight. Really, honestly, very good discussion. Look forward to the Commission proposal. Papers, Louise, Sibylle can be downloaded. We can make the reference available. Same about the EU-ASE papers on carbon pricing. So thank you.
Which haven't been discussed yet, but maybe for follow-up discussion. So, but in general, while people generally seem to agree that we need a price on carbon, it is also clear, and all of the participants stated that it will not be the silver bullet for the building sector. We have high expectations, and we also had this in Germany before carbon pricing was introduced. But we even saw that there are obstacles. But on the other hand, we had some actors which expected that other instruments might become obsolete, like funding and standards. So there's also really a threat on that. Thank you, Sibylle Braungardt, to highlight that it has been clear from the beginning on, and is still clear, that the gap is still very relevant, even with carbon prices and other measures. So we need more complementary measures. And even more, there are obstacles and market barriers, which also include low prices, low price flexibility. So Bertrand, you brought up this point from the very beginning on. And another is still the user-investor dilemma. We also have this in the commercial sector because there are also rented out commercial buildings to add on that. But in Germany, we also talked about the housing sector, and we are in the situation that the resulting costs from carbon pricing are solely borne by the tenants, which are 54%, as Sibylle highlighted. So the discussion on how to split the cost failed, and we do not expect a solution before the elections. Another issue just discussed is what to do with the revenues from carbon pricing, and the mainstream tends to say, okay, use it to lower electricity prices or give it back to consumers by 100%. And of course, the mitigation is social acceptance to mitigate social impacts. In the other case of lower electricity prices, of course, the main expectation and intention is to make fuel shifts more attractive. From our point of view, and also some of you highlighted this, it could be more intelligent or a better option to create a leverage effect and reuse those funds to overcome market barriers, such as upfront investments by funding, but it could also be used to target social vulnerable groups, and in all of those cases, to become more specific. Yes, other instruments stay still relevant. Maps, transparency, carrots and sticks, Louise highlighted this, and I would also like to recommend to use REP's report on that. And in case of lower electricity prices, we might also face a situation that we then have to compensate counter effects of this, especially in the commercial sector where electric cooling, where we have electric heating already. So the main issue is, of course, political will. So Germany started soft, and we expect maybe the Commission also to start soft, but there is a threat that you could stay soft, and there is no certainty to investors that there will become higher prices. There might also be a threat that policymakers do not allow higher prices, and corridors might be there and might persist. So, and this also applies for the EU level. So there could be a threat of too high expectations on price effects, coupled with weakened political actions and some compromises, for example, the EED, and this, of course, needs to be avoided. We spoke about different options, carbon tax, trading systems. Louise did that. With or without corridors, and it still seems to be that ETS is a dominant option in the discussion. Sibylle pointed out that there is a threat that downstream cap and trade systems might lead to incredible high price effects, which are also found very interesting and important. Hans Bergman has understandably been very cautious still under development, which we can understand. But we appreciated your clear message that you sent that carbon pricing is only one complementary measure. We need to make sure that this instrument would not undermine ambitions of other parts of the policy mix. And this was also underscored by the interventions of Louise and Sibylle. So what can we expect? Whatever the result is, it has to be expected that ETS or any other form of carbon pricing would be very likely to deliver too little stimulus for renovation and too late to arrive at the 2030 targets. So it needs to be complemented by other drivers like regulation, funding, and it also might draw political attentions away from policies which are actually important for the heavy lifting of the renovation wave, and it could maybe do more harm than good. So it will not significantly increase the demand for renovation, but it can, of course, and this is the good side, it can incentivize fuel switches, which are also necessary and desirable. But even this needs to be complemented by some extent. And again, Louise, you talked about carrot sticks and tambourines. Read the report. And as a follow-up for this discussion, I would like to invite you all to talk about a consistent policy framework mix. This is important, and not to talk only about sole instruments, but how they interact with each other. And another idea which came up to my mind is we should also take a look to the Nordic countries, where we have some carbon pricing experiences and practices. And we also, in particular for Sweden, we have even higher carbon prices, and we see from these countries that even there a mix is still needed, and that prices only led to incremental changes so far. So this would be my wrap up of this discussion. Thank you to all of that and to all of you, and I would like to give back to Bertrand to say goodbye. Thank you.
Right. No, thank you very much. It was great partnership with you, Christian and DENEFF. Want to thank again our speakers. Want to also thank the participants. And I know it's a bit frustrating not to see you and not for you to ask questions directly. Hopefully next time we'll be in person in Brussels. But for the time being, again, thanks. We'll look forward for the 14th of July, and we'll send you all the materials by email after the event. Thank you, and I wish you a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Bertrand.